Riley Klingel had learned long ago that the quietest people in any room were often the ones who owned it. She sat across from Dan Simmons in the Sterling House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive steakhouses, watching him gesture wildly to his business associates. His Rolex caught the candlelight as he described acquiring it. Limited edition, only 500 made worldwide, cost more than most people earned in half a year. The men around him nodded with appropriate admiration, and Dan's chest swelled visibly. Rilea sipped her water, a small smile playing at her lips. She'd stopped ordering wine after the first month of dating him. He always chose for her anyway, explaining which vintage paired best with her meal, never asking if she actually enjoyed red over white. The key to success, Dan announced, loud enough for neighboring tables to hear, is understanding value. Real value. Not everyone gets it. His associate, a balding man whose name Rilea had forgotten, leaned forward eagerly. Speaking of value, Dan, how's the manufacturing deal progressing? Something flickered across Dan's face, quick as lightning, gone just as fast. But Riley caught it. Fear. "Excuse me," Dan said smoothly, standing. "Important call." As he walked toward the hallway near the restrooms, Riley's mind drifted backward. 6 months ago, they'd driven across the country together. Montana had been her favorite stop. Endless sky, mountains that made you feel small in the best way. They'd gotten caught in a summer storm, ran laughing into a roadside motel with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed. Dan had held her close while thunder rattled the windows, and for those few hours, he'd been just a man. Not performing, not positioning himself, just present. She'd almost told him that night, almost explained that the gallery consultant job she mentioned was actually volunteer work she did twice monthly, helping new artists find their footing. Almost revealed that Klingel Industries, the name she'd casually dropped once or twice, wasn't just any company. It was hers, built from nothing, grown into something that employed thousands. But he'd kissed her forehead and said, "I love that you're so simple, Rilea. No complications, no drama, just sweet." Simple. The word had stung then, stung now. Dan's voice carried from the hallway, tense and low. Riley shouldn't have been able to hear him, but the acoustics in old buildings did strange things. His words came in fragments. "Don't have it. 72 hours. Investors are running." Her chest tightened. The deal was collapsing. She knew which one without needing details. She'd seen the contracts on his desk last week when she'd brought him lunch at his office. He'd swept them into a drawer quickly, kissed her cheek, told her not to worry her pretty head about boring business stuff. Riley pulled out her phone, typed quickly. "Mobilize the acquisition team. 20 members. The Sterling House, Manhattan. 9 tonight." Her executive assistant's response came within seconds. "Confirmed. They'll be ready." When Dan returned, his confidence had a brittle edge. He laughed too loudly at his own joke, drank his whiskey too fast. "Dan," Riley said softly, "I heard your call. If you're having trouble, I might know people." "People?" He cut her off, his smile condescending. "Baby, you're sweet for trying, but this isn't gallery work. This is real business. Millions on the line. Investors, contracts, supply chains. It's complicated." She absorbed the dismissal like she'd absorbed dozens before. "I appreciate that you care," he continued, patting her hand like she was a child. "But you wouldn't understand the pressure, the stakes." Rilea met his eyes. "Try me." "Rilea," his tone sharpened. "You work part-time arranging paintings. I'm dealing with manufacturing infrastructure, international shipping, corporate acquisitions. You're not—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "You're not at this level, and that's okay. I don't need you to be." The words landed like stones. His phone buzzed. He glanced down, and his face went pale. "I have important people arriving soon, associates who can actually help." "I could stay," she offered, though her throat felt tight. "No." The word came out harder than he'd probably intended. He softened it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You should go home. You'd just be uncomfortable. This kind of conversation, this kind of pressure, it's not your world. Rilia stood slowly, gathering her purse. Around them, other diners pretended not to notice the tension. You're right, she said quietly. It's not my world. Dan looked relieved. He stood, kissed her cheek quickly. I'll call you tomorrow. We'll do brunch, somewhere fun, okay? She nodded, turned toward the exit. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step measured and calm, but she didn't leave. Instead, Riley moved to a private booth in the far corner of the restaurant, partially hidden by the curved leather seating and strategic lighting. The Sterling house was built with old money sensibilities, spaces within spaces, alcoves for those who preferred discretion. She settled in, ordered a glass of California Cabernet from a waiter who recognized her instantly. His eyes widened slightly, but he was too professional to comment. Through the gap in the partition, she could see Dan returning to his table. His shoulders dropped with visible relief. The difficult girlfriend was gone. Now he could focus on real business with real players. Riley checked her phone. 8:57. 3 minutes. She thought about Montana again. The way he'd looked at her in that cheap motel room, rain hammering the roof. You make me feel like I can breathe, he'd said. Everyone else wants something from me. You just want me. The memory hurt worse than his words tonight. At exactly 9:03, the restaurant's front doors opened. The hostess straightened instinctively, her training kicking in before her brain processed what she was seeing. 20 people entered in succession. They moved with quiet authority, dressed impeccably, but without flash. No designer logos screaming for attention, just perfectly tailored clothes on people who'd earned their presence in rooms like this. Other diners began to notice. Whispers spread like wildfire. Is that James Copeland? From Seattle? Linda Torres just walked in. She never leaves Texas. Robert Chen, Wall Street legend. The 20 visitors paused, scanning the room with identical purpose. And then, as if choreographed, every single one of them turned toward Riley's corner. Dan watched from his table, confusion creasing his forehead. These were titans, people whose names moved markets, whose decisions employed tens of thousands, and they were walking past him without a glance. One by one, they approached Riley's booth. One by one, they waited for her to acknowledge them before sitting. Linda Torres spoke first, her voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. Ms. Klingel, we came as quickly as we could. What do you need? The restaurant fell into absolute silence. Dan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly, his whiskey glass tipped, amber liquid spreading across white linen. His associate grabbed his arm. Dan, who is that woman? But Dan couldn't answer. He could only stare as Robert Chen placed a leather portfolio in front of Ryla, as she opened it with the casual competence of someone who'd reviewed 1,000 such documents. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a tone Dan had never heard from her before. Not sweet, not simple. Command. The hospital acquisition in Boston needs restructuring, Linda. I want your team on the real estate assessment. James, your people handle the tech infrastructure integration. Robert, review their debt situation and give me options by morning. They nodded, pulling out tablets and phones, instantly mobilizing. A junior executive at Dan's table pulled up his phone, fingers flying across the screen. His face went slack. Dan, he whispered. Dan, you need to see this. He turned his phone around. The screen showed a news alert, the headline burning itself into Dan's vision. Mystery billionaire behind Klingel Industries finally revealed. Riley Klingel, youngest self-made female billionaire in American history. And beneath the headline, a photo of the woman he'd just sent home because she wasn't at his level. The woman who was now calmly directing some of the most powerful people in the country, her voice steady and sure, her eyes never once glancing his direction, as if he'd already ceased to exist in her world. Chapter 2. When silence breaks like thunder, Dan's hands trembled as he held his associate's phone, reading the article again, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Riley Klingel, founder and sole owner of Klingel Industries, built her empire from a single patent developed during college. Her company now spans manufacturing, technology development, renewable energy, and healthcare services. Conservative estimates place her personal wealth at $4.7 billion. Despite her influence, Klingel has remained notably private, rarely appearing in public forums and never granting press interviews. The phone slipped from his grip, clattering onto his plate. Across the restaurant, Riley continued her meeting as if the entire world hadn't just tilted sideways. She pointed to something in the portfolio, and three of her people immediately stood, moving to separate corners to make calls. Dan's mind spun backward, catching on moments he'd completely misunderstood. Their second date. She'd mentioned working on a project, and he'd assumed she meant arranging some gallery show. He'd spent the entire dinner talking about his plans to expand into the Midwest, his voice rising with excitement, painting himself as a visionary. She'd listened with those steady eyes, asking questions that seemed simple, but now felt surgical. What's your backup if the funding falls through? Have you considered the supply bottlenecks? Who's managing your liability exposure? He'd thought she was trying to understand his brilliance. Now he realized she'd been gently identifying every flaw in his strategy. "Sir?" The waiter appeared at his elbow. "Can I get you anything?" Dan shook his head, unable to form words. At Riley's booth, a man in an expensive suit materialized from nowhere. Security Dan had never noticed, despite sitting 30 feet away for the past hour. The guard positioned himself with the booth in his line of sight, relaxed but alert. How had Dan missed that? How had he missed all of it? Montana crashed back into his memory with brutal clarity. They'd been walking along a ridge trail, and she'd stopped to photograph the valley below with her phone. Not his fancy camera, her phone. "I love how small everything looks from up here," she'd said. "Reminds me that most problems aren't as big as they feel." He'd laughed, pulled her close. "You're so zen. It's adorable." She'd gone quiet after that. He'd thought she was just enjoying the view. Now he understood. She'd been standing on a mountain, running a billion-dollar empire from her phone, and he'd called her adorable for having perspective. His associate tugged his sleeve urgently. "Dan, they're talking about your company." Dan's head snapped up. One of Relaya's team members, a sharp-featured woman he vaguely recognized from financial news programs, was speaking. "Simmons Manufacturing has solid infrastructure but catastrophic management decisions. The debt structure is survivable if we act quickly. Question is whether it's worth the effort." Another team member shuffled through papers. "Assets are undervalued, location is prime, workforce is experienced, the framework's salvageable." Linda Torres leaned back, considering. "Recommendation." The sharp-featured woman didn't hesitate. "Buy the debt restructure. Remove current leadership entirely. Install our own management team. We could have this profitable within 18 months. Dan felt his stomach drop through the floor. Riley had been listening quietly. Now she spoke, her tone carrying no emotion whatsoever. "Run full analysis by morning. If the numbers support acquisition, move forward. But I want nothing to do with existing leadership. Clean sweep. Offer standard severance packages and move on." "Understood." 3 voices responded in unison. Just like that, his company's fate was sealed, decided in 30 seconds by the woman he'd told to go home. Dan tried to stand, to approach, to explain. He didn't even know what he'd say, just that he needed to say something. But the security guard shifted slightly, and Dan found himself sitting back down without quite knowing why. The man hadn't touched him, hadn't spoken, but the message was crystal clear. "Stay back." His phone buzzed. His lawyer's name flashed on the screen. "Dan, where are you? We have a serious problem. Someone just purchased 70% of your company's outstanding debt. They're calling it in, all of it. We have 48 hours to respond, or they start liquidation proceedings. Who did you piss off?" Dan couldn't answer. He watched Riley across the restaurant, surrounded by people who moved when she spoke, who waited for her approval before acting, who treated her with the kind of respect Dan had always craved but never quite achieved. She reached for her water glass, and the motion triggered another memory: Sedona. They'd hiked to a spot overlooking red rock formations, and she'd pointed out different geological layers, explaining how they formed over millions of years. He'd kissed her to shut her up, thinking she was being nerdy. "You're so cute when you try to be smart," he'd said. Her smile had faded. She'd walked ahead of him the rest of the trail. He'd thought she was being moody. Now he wanted to scream. Robert Chen was showing Riley something on his tablet. She nodded, made a note, then said something that made the entire group laugh. It wasn't polite laughter. It was genuine, the kind that comes from people who actually enjoy each other's company. Dan had never made her laugh like that. He'd made her smile, sure, but always in that soft, quiet way. He'd thought she was just reserved. What if she'd just been bored? His associate was reading more articles, his face growing progressively more horrified. "Dan, there are dozens of profiles here. She's on the boards of 6 major hospitals. She funded an entire scholarship program for women in business. She personally mentored 50 entrepreneurs last year. She's turned down interviews with everyone from financial networks to major magazines because she, and I quote, prefers to let her work speak for itself." "Stop," Dan whispered. "She built her first company while she was still in college, sold it for $200 million, then invested every penny into what became Klingel Industries. She's never taken a salary. Everything she makes goes back into expansion or charity work. Dan, she's—" "Stop!" But the words kept coming, each one another nail in the coffin of his pride. Every article painted the same picture: a woman who'd built an empire through brilliance and determination, who wielded enormous power with quiet grace, who valued substance over show. Everything Dan pretended to be, she actually was. Across the room, Riley's meeting began to break up. Her team dispersed efficiently, some heading for the exit, others clustering in smaller groups to coordinate next steps. The restaurant slowly returned to normal volume, though Dan could feel eyes on him. Other diners who'd witnessed his humiliation, who'd seen the great Dan Simmons revealed as a fool. Riley stood, gathering her things with unhurried precision. She spoke briefly with Linda Torres, then with James Copeland. Both nodded, shook her hand with obvious respect, and then, for the first time since her team arrived, Riley looked directly at Dan. The expression in her eyes wasn't anger, wasn't hurt. It was something infinitely worse: indifference. She looked at him the way you'd look at a stranger on the subway. A brief acknowledgement of existence, then immediate dismissal as her attention moved to more important things. Dan felt something crack deep in his chest. She walked toward the exit, her security guard falling into step beside her. She didn't look back. His phone rang again. His lawyer, more frantic now. "Dan, are you listening? This is serious. Whoever bought your debt is moving fast. They've already filed preliminary paperwork for restructuring. If we don't respond immediately, you're going to lose everything. The company, your position, your equity, all of it. Dan, are you there?" "Yeah," he managed. "I'm here." "Who is it? Who bought the debt?" Dan watched Riley disappear through the restaurant doors, watched the most powerful people in the room defer to her, watched his entire world collapse into the truth he'd been too blind to see. "My fiancé," he said quietly. "What?" "The woman I just told to go home because she wasn't at my level." Silence on the other end of the line. Then quietly, "Dan, what did you do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What had he done? He'd taken a woman worth billions and made her feel small. He'd interrupted her, dismissed her, patronized her. He'd been so busy performing success that he'd missed actual achievement sitting across from him. The waiter approached nervously with his bill. Dan reached for his wallet automatically, then froze. The bill had already been paid. by Relay's account, with a handwritten note at the bottom in her distinctive script. Thank you for dinner. Consider this a farewell gift. You'll need to budget more carefully soon. Dan sat alone at his table, his associates making excuses to leave, the other diners pointedly not looking at him, and read that note over and over until the words stopped making sense. She'd paid for his meal, his expensive whiskey, his overpriced steak. She'd covered it all, the way you'd cover a check for someone you pitied. His phone buzzed one more time, not his lawyer this time. An email notification from Klingel Industries Human Resources. The subject line, restructuring and transition information. He opened it with shaking hands, already knowing what he'd find, but needing to see it anyway. His company had been acquired, effective immediately. He was being retained as a regional operations manager, a title that sounded important but meant nothing, a mercy position that would keep him employed while stripping away every shred of authority he'd built. His office would be relocated, his staff reassigned, his decisions subject to approval from people he'd never meet. The email was professionally written, outlining severance options and transition timelines, but at the very bottom, hidden in the signature block, was a line that hadn't been there in the standard template. A handwritten addition, scanned and inserted. You were right, Dan. We weren't at the same level. I hope you find someone who is. Dan read those words until the restaurant closed around him, until the staff began cleaning tables, until the manager gently suggested he might want to head home. But where was home now? The penthouse he could no longer afford, the life he'd built on borrowed confidence and hollow performance. He stepped out into the Manhattan night, and for the first time in his adult life, Dan Simmons had absolutely no idea what came next. Chapter 3. The Price of Pride. 3 weeks crawled by like broken glass under bare feet. Dan sat in his new office, a corner space that would have seemed generous to anyone who didn't know he'd previously occupied the entire executive floor. The window overlooked a parking garage instead of the city skyline. His desk, while functional, came from the same catalog as every other manager's furniture. He'd become ordinary overnight. Every morning, reports crossed his desk, stamped with approval codes he didn't recognize. RK7, RK12, RK23. It took him embarrassingly long to realize what RK stood for, Riley Klingel. Her initials marked every major decision in the company he'd built, reminding him with each document that someone else now controlled his legacy. His former executive team had been reassigned or let go. New people filled the important positions, arriving with quiet competence and zero interest in Dan's input. They were polite, professional, and utterly indifferent to his presence. At lunch, Dan ate alone. His colleagues, the ones who used to hang on his every word, laugh at his jokes, compete for his attention, now found urgent reasons to sit elsewhere. Nobody said anything cruel. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, they simply edited him out of their world, the way you'd delete an embarrassing photo. The story had spread through their industry like wildfire. Everyone knew. The man who dismissed his billionaire fiancé, the fool who told one of the most powerful women in America to go home because she wasn't at his level. He'd become a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and bars. Worse were the moments when he'd glimpse Riley. She visited headquarters occasionally, moving through the building with the same quiet authority she'd displayed at the Sterling House. People straightened when she approached, not from fear but from genuine respect. She remembered names, asked about projects with actual interest, listened when people spoke. Everything Dan had faked, she embodied naturally. Once, they'd passed in the lobby. Dan had frozen, his prepared speech evaporating. She'd glanced at him with those steady eyes, nodded once, the way you'd acknowledge any employee, and continued walking. Her security detail hadn't even bothered tensing. He was that irrelevant now. That night, Dan couldn't sleep. He kept replaying their relationship like a film he'd seen wrong the first time, their first date. Coffee shop in Brooklyn, nothing fancy. She'd worn jeans and a sweater, smiled when he'd made self-deprecating jokes about his startup struggles. "Tell me about your work," she'd said. He'd talked for an hour about his vision, his plans, his dreams of building something meaningful. She'd listened intently, asked insightful questions that made him think harder about his answers. He'd never asked about her work. Not once. Not on that date, or any that followed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. In an entire year together, he'd never asked what she did beyond the most superficial acknowledgement. She'd mentioned her company exactly twice, and both times he'd glossed over it, eager to return the conversation to his ventures. He'd been so certain he was the impressive one in the relationship. Dan pulled up old photos on his phone. Their road trip dominated his gallery. There was Relea in Montana, laughing as rain soaked through her shirt. Relea in Colorado, pointing at something off-camera while he'd snapped the shot. Relea in a dozen different places, always smiling but never quite meeting his eyes in the photos. He zoomed in on one image. Sedona, sunset, painting the rocks orange and gold. She stood at the edge of a cliff, wind catching her hair. She looked powerful in that moment, not in the way he'd always demanded attention, but in the way mountains were powerful, solid, enduring, requiring no validation. "You're so beautiful," he'd said when he'd taken that picture. "Thank you," she'd replied. Then after a pause, "Do you ever wonder what I'm thinking about when you take these?" "You're probably thinking about how lucky you are," he'd joked. She'd smiled, that soft, sad smile he'd mistaken for contentment. "Yeah," she'd said, "lucky." Dan set his phone down, his hands shaking. She'd tried so many times. She'd tried to let him see her. And he'd been too infatuated with his own reflection to notice. His apartment felt suffocating. The penthouse lease ended in a week, and he'd found a modest place in Queens, nice enough, but a universe away from the luxury he'd flaunted. The movers would come soon to pack up his carefully curated life. His phone buzzed. A business publication notification. Klingel Industries announces major expansion. New healthcare initiative to serve underinsured communities. Dan opened the article against his better judgment. There was Riley's photo, professional but not pretentious. The article detailed her company's plan to open 15 new community health centers in underserved areas. The budget ran into hundreds of millions. A quote from her interview: "Healthcare shouldn't be a luxury. Everyone deserves access to quality treatment, regardless of their financial situation. We're not doing this for profit. We're doing this because it's right." The article mentioned her personal involvement. She'd be visiting each community, meeting with local leaders, ensuring the centers actually served the people who needed them. Most Dan thought about the watch he'd bragged about at the Sterling house, the one that cost more than some people made in half a year. He'd been so proud of owning something exclusive. Riley was building hospitals for people who couldn't afford basic care. His phone rang, his mother calling for their weekly check-in. "Danny, how are you holding up?" He almost lied, almost painted it as a strategic career move, a chance to explore new opportunities. But something in him had cracked open, and the truth spilled out. "I ruined everything, Mom. I had someone extraordinary, and I made her feel worthless because I was too stupid to see what was right in front of me." His mother was quiet for a long moment. "The woman from the news, your fiancé?" "She was never really my fiancé. I asked, she said yes, but we never set a date. Looking back, I think she was waiting to see if I'd ever actually see her." "And you didn't?" "I saw a pretty face and an easy personality. I saw someone who didn't challenge me, who made me feel important. I never saw her." "Can you apologize?" Dan laughed bitterly. "I tried. Her assistant politely informed me that Ms. Klingel doesn't take personal calls from regional managers. I'm blocked from her email. Her security detail makes sure I'm never in her vicinity at headquarters. I've been erased, Mom, completely and efficiently erased." "Maybe that's what you deserve," his mother said gently. The words stung because they were true. "Yeah," Dan whispered. "Maybe it is." After hanging up, Dan opened his laptop. He'd drafted 7 letters to Riley, each one increasingly desperate, each one still sitting in his drafts folder unsent. Words felt meaningless when his actions had spoken so loudly. He started an 8th letter anyway. Riley, I don't expect you to read this, I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know that I finally understand what I lost. Not your money. I never cared about that, which is probably the only decent thing about me. I lost the chance to know someone remarkable. I lost the privilege of being seen by someone who actually saw the world clearly. I made you small to make myself feel big, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. You deserved a partner. I gave you an audience member who was too busy watching his own performance to notice you were the real show. I'm sorry it's inadequate, but it's true. I'm sorry. He saved it with the others. Unsent, because what would sending it accomplish except making him feel better? This wasn't about his feelings anymore. His phone buzzed again. A colleague from his old life, someone he'd considered a friend before everything collapsed. The message was short. Saw Relay at an industry mixer tonight. She's dating someone, venture guy from California. They were actually talking business together, like real back-and-forth conversation. She looked happy, thought you should know. Dan stared at that message until his vision blurred. She'd moved on. Of course she had. Women like Riley didn't wait around for men like him to grow up. The venture guy from California probably asked about her work, probably listened when she spoke, probably treated her like the brilliant, accomplished woman she was instead of a pleasant accessory good for her. The thought hurt like nothing Dan had ever experienced, but underneath the pain was something else, something that felt almost like relief. She deserved that. She deserved someone who met her at her level, her actual level, not the one he'd imagined. Dan closed his laptop, looked around his soon-to-be former penthouse, and felt the full weight of his choices settle onto his shoulders. He'd wanted to be important so badly that he'd convinced himself he was. He'd performed success instead of achieving it. He'd collected expensive things instead of meaningful experiences. He'd talked endlessly about value while failing to recognize it in the person closest to him. The movers would come next week. His new job paid enough to live on, but not enough to impress anyone. His social circle had evaporated, his reputation was destroyed, and somehow, sitting in the wreckage of his own making, Dan felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years: humility. It wasn't comfortable. It didn't make anything better, but it was real in a way nothing else in his life had been. His phone lit up one more time. An automated email from Klingel Industries HR. Final severance package details. They were being generous, more than generous. Enough to cover his transition, to give him breathing room to figure out what came next. At the bottom of the email, beneath all the legal language and corporate formatting, was a single line that hadn't come from any template. Everyone deserves a chance to start over. Don't waste it. No signature. No indication of who'd added it. But Dan knew Riley's handwriting even in digital form. She was giving him a gift. Not forgiveness. He didn't deserve that. But a chance. An opportunity to become someone better than the man who'd dismissed her. Dan read that line over and over, and for the first time since the Sterling house, he felt something other than despair. He felt possibility. Small, fragile, uncertain, but there. Chapter 4. The woman he never knew. 6 months evaporated like water on hot pavement. Dan moved through his life in a way that felt simultaneously slower and faster than before. The rhythm had changed. No more racing between meetings designed to make him feel essential. No more checking his phone every 5 minutes for validation disguised as urgent messages. No more performing. His apartment in Queens was quiet. He'd furnished it simply, nothing expensive, nothing meant to impress visitors. He never invited a decent couch. A coffee table from a second-hand store that wobbled slightly. Bookshelves he'd assembled himself, filled with books he was actually reading instead of displaying work, became just that. Work. He arrived on time, completed his assignments competently, and left without fanfare. His colleagues remained cordial and distant. That hurt less now. He'd earned their coldness. The real change happened outside office hours. Dan had started volunteering at a community center in his neighborhood, not the kind of volunteering that came with photo opportunities and press releases, the unglamorous kind. Tuesday evenings, he taught basic business skills to people trying to start their own ventures. Budgeting, planning, how to write a simple contract. Nothing sophisticated, but practical. His students were men and women rebuilding from various wreckages: bankruptcy, divorce, addiction, incarceration. They showed up tired from day jobs, hopeful despite everything life had thrown at them, and genuinely grateful for any guidance teaching them forced Dan to strip away all the jargon he'd hidden behind for years. These folks didn't need theories. They needed answers. How do I price my services? Where do I find customers? What do I do when someone doesn't pay? The questions were simple, but not easy. Don't overcomplicate, he found himself saying repeatedly. Start with what you know, build from there, and be honest about what you don't understand yet. Advice he'd never followed himself. One student, a woman named Jennifer, trying to launch a house cleaning service, had asked him during break, "Have you always been good with money?" Dan had laughed before he could stop himself. "No, I've made every mistake you can imagine, some of them spectacular." "But you figured it out?" "Still figuring it out," he'd admitted. "Every day." Jennifer had nodded, satisfied. "That's good. Makes me feel less stupid." "You're not stupid. You're brave. Starting something from nothing takes guts." She'd smiled at that, and Dan had felt something he couldn't quite name: purpose, maybe, the kind that didn't require an audience. The center's director, a woman named Angela, who ran everything on fumes and determination, had pulled him aside after class one evening. "The students love you," she'd said. "You explain things in ways that make sense. Have you thought about expanding your hours?" "I work during the week. Saturdays? We're looking for someone to help with our entrepreneur workshop series." Dan had agreed without hesitation. What else was he going to do with his Saturdays? The social calendar that once packed his weekends had evaporated along with his status. So now he spent Saturday mornings at the center, helping people who'd never had advantages write business plans that might actually work. It was humbling work, necessary work. Work that mattered more than anything he'd done while chasing importance. Still, Riley haunted him in ways he couldn't shake. Every business publication seemed to feature her. She'd expanded into 3 new sectors. Her company's valuation had jumped by billions. She'd been invited to speak at economic summits but declined, as always, preferring to work quietly. One article mentioned her dating life in passing, notoriously private, though sources suggest she's currently in a relationship with a prominent West Coast entrepreneur. The article included a blurry photo of Riley walking beside a tall man, both of them laughing at something off camera. Dan had stared at that photo longer than he should have. She looked lighter somehow, less guarded. The way she'd looked in Montana before he'd made her retreat into silence. He was happy for her. He was. The bitterness that would have consumed him months ago had burned itself out, leaving something clearer in its place. She deserved joy. She deserved someone who appreciated her mind as much as her smile. She deserved everything he'd been too shallow to give therapy helped. Dan had resisted initially, another performance of being fixed rather than actually fixing anything. But his therapist, a no-nonsense woman who refused to let him deflect, had gradually pried open truths he'd spent years avoiding. "You wanted validation," she'd observed during one session. "External proof that you mattered. When did you stop believing you had inherent worth?" Dan had sat with that question for weeks. The answer, when it finally came, was uncomfortable. He'd grown up middle class, comfortable but not wealthy. His parents were kind, supportive, utterly normal. They'd told him he could be anything he wanted, and he'd interpreted that as a requirement to be extraordinary. Being ordinary felt like failure, so he'd built a persona designed to dazzle, to command attention, to prove his specialness. And in doing so, he'd hollowed himself out until there was nothing inside but the performance Riley hadn't needed to perform. She'd actually achieved things, then moved on to achieve more without needing applause. Her worth came from within, solid and unshakable. He'd been so threatened by that without even realizing it. Dan deleted his social media accounts. Not dramatically, no farewell posts or explanations. He just removed himself from the constant scroll of curated lives and manufactured moments. The silence was strange at first. Then, freeing his phone, held fewer than 10 contacts now. His mother, his sister, Angela from the community center, a handful of colleagues for work emergencies. His life had contracted to something manageable, and unexpectedly, he felt less lonely than when he'd been surrounded by hundreds of shallow connections. One Saturday afternoon, Angela mentioned the center was struggling to find affordable space for expansion. "We've outgrown this building," she explained, frustration evident. "There's demand for more programs, more classes, but rent in this city is impossible. I've been looking for months. Everything's either too expensive or too far from the communities we serve." Dan had nodded sympathetically, wishing he could help, but knowing his current resources were laughable compared to the problem. That evening, as he was packing up his teaching materials, a black car pulled up outside the center, not ostentatious, but clearly expensive. The kind of vehicle that signaled wealth without screaming about it. The door opened, and Riley stepped out. Dan's breath caught. He hadn't seen her in person since the lobby incident months ago. She wore dark jeans and a simple jacket, her hair pulled back, no makeup he could detect. She looked exactly like the woman he'd fallen for on that first coffee shop date. But everything else was different now. He could see it in the way she moved, in the confidence that radiated from her without any performance required. This was her neighborhood, her roots. Angela rushed out to greet her, clearly starstruck. "Ms. Klingel, thank you so much for coming. I can't believe you're actually here." "Please call me Relaya," she said warmly. "You're doing remarkable work here. I've been following your programs for a while." Dan stayed inside, watching through the window. His heart hammered against his ribs. They spoke for several minutes, Relaya asking questions and Angela answering with increasing animation. Then Relaya pulled out her phone, made a few calls while Angela waited, and within 10 minutes had apparently solved the space problem. Dan couldn't hear the details, but Angela's expression told the story. Tears, laughter, an impulsive hug that Riley returned without hesitation. When Angela came back inside, she was shaking. "Dan, you won't believe this. She owns a building 6 blocks from here. She's letting us use it rent-free for 5 years while we establish sustainable funding. 5 years. Do you understand how impossible that is? How many programs we can run? How many people we can help?" "That's incredible," Dan managed. "She said she grew up in this neighborhood, said her mother used to bring her to this center when it was just starting out. She's been looking for ways to give back without making it about her name or publicity." Of course she had. That was exactly who Relaya was. Angela grabbed his arm. "Here's the crazy part. She has one condition for the building use." Dan's stomach tightened. "She wants you to lead the expansion project." "What?" "You, specifically. She said she's heard good things about your teaching, that students speak highly of your approach. She wants someone who understands both the business side and the community's actual needs." "Dan, this is huge. This could become your full-time position. We've been trying to fund a director role for expansion, and she's offering to cover the salary for the first year while we build out the programs." Dan looked out the window. Riley was still there, talking on her phone, probably rearranging someone's entire world with a few calm sentences. "I don't understand," he said. "Why me?" Angela handed him a folder. Inside were detailed plans for the expansion, budgets, timelines, program proposals. Everything he'd need to get started. A note was tucked in the back, handwritten on expensive stationery. "You wanted to know what my level looks like. This is it. Prove you can work without ego, without credit, without any benefit to yourself beyond the satisfaction of helping others. 6 months. Then we'll see if you've changed at all." Dan's hands trembled as he read it twice, 3 times. She was testing him. No, that wasn't quite right. She was offering him a chance to prove to himself that he could be better. Beneath the note was something else. A photograph. The one from Montana, both of them laughing in the rain, soaked and happy on the back, in her careful handwriting. I loved the man I thought you were. Show me if he ever existed. Dan looked up. Through the window, he saw Ryla getting back into her car. For just a moment, she glanced toward the building. Their eyes met across the distance. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just held his gaze for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Then she was gone, the car pulling smoothly into traffic. Angela was talking, excited about possibilities and timelines, but Dan barely heard her. He clutched the folder, feeling the weight of Riley's challenge settle onto his shoulders. 6 months, no ego, no credit, just work. He'd spent his entire adult life chasing recognition. Now he was being offered a chance to accomplish something meaningful while remaining completely invisible. It should have felt like punishment. Instead, it felt like the first honest opportunity anyone had ever given him. Chapter 5. Falling from Grace. 4 months into the expansion project, Dan's hands bled from honest work for the first time in his life, not metaphorically. Actually bled. He'd been helping install drywall in what would become the center's new classroom space when the sheet slipped, catching the edge of his palm. Blood welled up bright red against his skin. A construction worker named Miguel had wordlessly handed him a bandage, showed him how to wrap it properly, and they'd gone back to work. No drama, no rushing to emergency rooms, just a bandage and back to the job. That moment somehow meant more to Dan than any deal he'd closed in his previous life. The building Rilia had provided was magnificent. Old bones, solid structure, perfect location, but it needed everything. New electrical, updated plumbing, walls moved, floors refinished. The kind of renovation that required endless decisions, constant problem-solving, and the patience to manage dozens of moving pieces simultaneously. Dan worked 70-hour weeks. Not because anyone demanded it, but because the work mattered in ways he'd never experienced before. Every classroom they built would educate real people. Every office they created would serve actual needs. The space wasn't a monument to anyone's ego. It was a tool for community transformation. His name appeared nowhere on the project materials. Angela handled all external communications. When reporters came to cover the center's expansion, Dan made himself scarce. The story wasn't about him. For possibly the first time in his adult life, Dan worked on something where his invisibility was the entire point. The shift felt profound. Money was tight. The salary Riley had funded was modest, enough to live on, nothing extra. Dan's wardrobe simplified to jeans and work shirts. His watch collection, those status symbols he'd once bragged about, got sold off piece by piece to cover unexpected project costs. He couldn't bring himself to bill against the center's budget. The Patek Philippe he'd mentioned at the Sterling House went last. He'd paid a small fortune for it, sold it for half that amount to a collector who didn't know or care about Dan's fall from grace. The money paid for new computers in the learning lab. Fair trade. His social life existed entirely within the center's walls now. He knew the students by name, knew their struggles, celebrated their small victories. Jennifer had successfully launched her cleaning service and now employed 3 other women from the neighborhood. Tommy, the young man from his business class, had gotten sober and steady work at a local accounting firm. Maria's daughter had won a scholarship to a good school. These were his friends now, people who'd faced real hardship, real failure, and kept pushing forward anyway. They made Dan's previous social circle look like hollow cardboard cutouts. But Rilea still haunted the edges of everything. He saw evidence of her everywhere, though never her actual presence. The building had been renovated recently. Rilea's work clearly, preparing it for the center's use before they'd even known about the opportunity. The computers in the lab bore discrete tags indicating they'd been donated by Klingel Industries. The scholarship fund that had helped Maria's daughter carried Riley's initials. Buried in the fine print, she was everywhere and nowhere, helping without needing recognition, changing lives from a distance. Dan found himself wondering what she was doing, then forcing himself to stop. That wasn't his business anymore. She'd moved on. The blurry photo of her with the California entrepreneur had been followed by others, attending charity events, speaking at a rare public forum on women in business, living a life that had no room for Dan's regrets. Good. She deserved that. One evening, Dan stayed late finishing paperwork for their permit applications. The building was empty, lights off except for the small office he'd claimed. He'd just discovered a mistake in the electrical contractor's estimate, a significant one that would eat into their contingency budget. When he heard footsteps, Rilia appeared in the doorway like a ghost made real. Dan's heart stopped. She wore the same simple style as before. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress, but she looked exhausted in a way that made him want to offer her tea and a comfortable chair in silence, until she felt rested. He didn't move, didn't speak. Let her control the moment. "Angela told me you've been working ridiculous hours," Rilia said finally. Her voice carried no warmth but no hostility either, neutral, professional. "The project needs it. The project needs you not to burn out before it's complete." Dan gestured at the papers spread across his makeshift desk. "Found an error in the electrical estimate. I'm trying to figure out how to cover the gap without cutting programs." Rilia stepped into the room, glanced at his calculations. Her mind processed the numbers in seconds. "Renegotiate the lighting fixtures. Go with commercial grade instead of designer. You'll save enough to cover the electrical overage and still have breathing room." The designer fixtures were supposed to make the spaces feel more welcoming. Light makes spaces welcoming. Expensive fixtures make designers happy. The people using these rooms won't know the difference. She was right. Obviously right, Dan made the note, feeling simultaneously grateful and inadequate. "Thank you," he said. Rilia nodded, turned to leave, then paused. "The students speak well of you. They say you actually listen instead of just waiting to talk." The compliment hit harder than any praise he'd received in his previous life. "I'm learning," Dan said quietly, slowly. "Learning is good." She moved toward the door again, then stopped once more. "This neighborhood, I grew up here. These streets, these buildings, these people. They raised me when I had nothing. My mother cleaned offices in places like this, worked herself to exhaustion so I could have opportunities she never got." Dan remained silent, sensing she wasn't finished. "I bought this building because my mother used to clean it. She'd bring me along sometimes after school, let me do homework in empty conference rooms while she scrubbed floors. I'd watch her work and promise myself that someday I'd own buildings instead of cleaning them." "Did she see you succeed?" Dan asked gently. "She passed before the first big sale went through, never got to see what her sacrifices built." The pain in Riley's voice was subtle but unmistakable. "I'm sorry," Dan said, meaning it deeply. This center mattered to her. She volunteered here when she could spare time, helped in the kitchen, tutored kids in reading. She believed in giving back to the community that supported us. Dan understood now. This wasn't just philanthropy for Riley. This was honoring her mother's memory, continuing her work, making her sacrifices mean something. "We'll do right by this space," Dan promised. "I swear it." Riley met his eyes fully for the first time since entering. "I know. That's why I chose you. You could have picked someone with more experience, better credentials." "Experience and credentials don't mean someone will care about the outcome. I needed someone who understood what it felt like to have everything and lose it. Someone humble enough now to work without needing applause." "You think I'm humble?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I think you're learning humility. There's a difference." Before Dan could respond, Riley's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression shifting to business mode. "I have to go meeting in 20 minutes across town." "Of course." She headed for the exit, then turned back one last time. "Dan?" "Yes?" "The expansion project has 3 months left. After that, We'll talk about whether you stay on permanently or move to something else. Angela's written glowing reports, but I need to see the finished product before making that decision. Understood. And Dan, stop selling your personal belongings to cover project costs. That's not your responsibility. Submit proper expense reports. Dan's face flushed. How did you... I pay attention. Submit the reports. Use the budget. That's what it's there for. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Dan alone with his papers and the lingering scent of her perfume. Something subtle and clean that reminded him of Montana rain. He sat in the silence, processing everything she'd shared. Her mother, her roots, her reasons. He'd known so little about her when they were together. He'd been too busy talking about himself to ask about her history, her family, her journey. She'd been an orphan building an empire to honor her mother's memory, and he'd never even thought to ask about her childhood. The weight of that failure pressed down on him, fresh and heavy. But beneath the regret was something else. Gratitude. She'd trusted him with this project despite everything. She'd given him a chance to prove he could change, to show he was capable of working towards something bigger than his own ego. Dan looked at the plans spread across his desk. 3 months to complete this project. 3 months to prove he could be someone worth keeping around. Not for her. He'd already lost that chance, and she'd made it clear through her professionalism that their personal history was exactly that. History, but for himself. For the people this center would serve. For the memory of a woman he'd never met who'd scrubbed floors so her daughter could own buildings. He pulled the electrical contractor's estimate back toward him and started reworking the numbers with Riley's suggestion in mind. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening rhythms. Somewhere in this city, Riley was heading to her meeting, managing her empire, living a life that had moved far beyond the restaurant where Dan had told her to go home, and here he was, in a half-renovated building in the neighborhood where she'd grown up, finally doing work that mattered. The irony wasn't lost on him. But maybe, Dan thought as he finalized the revised budget, maybe that was the point. Riley had risen from these streets to unimaginable heights. Dan had fallen from manufactured heights to these same streets. The difference was she'd stayed connected to where she came from. He'd spent years running from anything that felt ordinary. Now ordinary was the only thing he wanted to be. Ordinary and useful and present in ways that actually helped, instead of just performing help for the cameras that weren't there anymore. Dan worked until midnight, perfecting the plans, then locked up and walked home through streets Riley's mother had once walked. The connection felt sacred somehow. 3 months. He could do this right in 3 months. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally become someone his former fiancé might recognize as an actual human being instead of a cautionary tale. Chapter 6. The Second Condition. The expansion project was completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule and $7,000 under budget. Dan stood in the main classroom on opening day, watching families stream through doors that he'd helped hang, walking on floors he'd helped refinish. Kids ran toward the new computer lab while their parents talked with Angela about program enrollment. The space hummed with energy and promise. Nobody knew his name. Nobody thanked him specifically. The local news crew interviewing Angela didn't ask about project leadership. Dan had never felt prouder of anything in his life. Angela found him during a quiet moment, her eyes bright with emotion. "We did it. Actually did it." "You did it," Dan corrected. "I just followed your vision." "Liar." She squeezed his shoulder affectionately. "But a kind liar, so I'll allow it." As the celebration wound down, a courier arrived with a package addressed to Dan. Inside was a single envelope, expensive paper, his name written in Riley's distinctive handwriting. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. "Congratulations on completing the first condition. Your work here has been exemplary. Angela's reports, the community feedback, and the actual results all confirm that you've approached this project with genuine dedication rather than performance. However, completing one project doesn't demonstrate sustained change. Therefore, The second condition, attend every class at Northside Community College this semester. Not as an instructor, as a student. Enrollment materials are enclosed. Your first class begins Monday evening. Business fundamentals. Dan reread the letter 3 times, confusion mounting. He had a business degree. He'd run a company, made deals, navigated complex negotiations. Why would Riley want him taking introductory business classes? The second page provided clarity. You'll study alongside people starting over, individuals rebuilding after setbacks, learning skills they never had access to before. You'll sit in those uncomfortable plastic chairs, struggle through homework after long work days, and maybe, finally, understand what most people face when trying to improve their circumstances. You built a company from privilege and connections. Learn what it looks like to build a life from nothing. Dan sat heavily on one of the new classroom benches. She was right. Everything in his previous life had come relatively easy. Supportive family, good education, network of contacts, money to take risks. He'd thought himself self-made, but he'd started from third base and acted like he'd hit a home run. The enrollment materials included a schedule Monday and Wednesday evenings, business fundamentals, introduction to accounting, computer skills for workplace success, classes he could teach in his sleep. Being forced to take them felt humiliating, which was probably exactly the point. Monday arrived faster than Dan wanted. He showed up at Northside Community College with a backpack he'd bought at a discount store and a stomach full of nerves. The campus was modest, a few buildings clustered around a central quad, nothing fancy, everything functional. The classroom held 20 students ranging in age and background. Dan took a seat in the back, hoping to remain invisible. The woman next to him offered a friendly smile. "First day?" "Yeah," Dan admitted. "Me too. I'm Maria. Well, not the Maria you might know, different Maria. There's like 5 of us in this program." She laughed easily, and Dan found himself relaxing slightly. "Dan?" He introduced himself, keeping it simple. "Nice to meet you, Dan. What brings you here?" "Long story." "You?" Maria's expression turned serious. "Got out of a bad marriage. Spent years being told I was too stupid to work, too useless to manage money. Figured I'd prove that wrong." The raw honesty startled Dan. "I'm sorry you went through that." "I'm not anymore. I'm out, I'm safe, and I'm building something new. This," she gestured at the classroom, "this is me taking my life back." Dan felt small next to her courage. The professor arrived, a tired-looking man named Mr. Harrison, who'd clearly taught this class 100 times, but still managed to sound engaged. He started with introductions, asking each student to share why they'd enrolled. The stories were humbling. Jennifer, sitting 2 rows up, had worked the same job for decades before being laid off when her company downsized. "I'm starting over at an age when I thought I'd be retiring." Tommy, a young guy with nervous energy, spoke quietly about getting clean and wanting to prove he could build a stable life. "My family doesn't believe I can do this. I need to prove it to myself first." When Dan's turn came, he kept it simple. "I made some mistakes in my career. I'm here to learn how to do better." Nobody pushed for details. In this room, everyone was rebuilding. Reasons didn't matter as much as the effort. The coursework was basic but more challenging than Dan expected. Not intellectually, he understood the concepts easily enough. The challenge came from the homework, due at the end of long days spent working at the center, completed while exhausted on his couch in Queens. Understanding business theory was easy. Doing the work when you were bone-tired and had nothing left to give. That was the lesson Riley wanted him to learn. Study groups formed naturally. Dan found himself at the library on Thursday evenings with Maria, Jennifer, and Tommy, working through assignments together. Maria struggled with financial projections. Dan helped her break down the formulas into manageable pieces, explaining concepts without condescension. "You make this make sense," Maria said gratefully. "Professor Harrison is nice, but he talks like we already know half of what he's teaching." "You're smarter than you think," Dan told her. Your ex-husband was wrong about you. Her eyes welled up. Thanks. I needed to hear that today. Helping Maria gave Dan a satisfaction he'd never experienced closing million-dollar deals. This mattered in a direct human way that corporate success never had. Tommy got a job interview for an entry-level position at an accounting firm. The kid was brilliant with numbers, but terrified of the professional world. I don't even have a suit, he confessed during one study session. I can't show up in jeans. They'll take one look and know I'm a screw-up. Dan went home that night, dug through his closet, and found his old interview suits, the expensive ones from his previous life. They'd be too large for Tommy, but alterations were cheap. He brought 3 suits to their next study session. Pick one, consider it a loan until you can afford your own. Tommy stared at the suits like they were made of gold. Dan, I can't. These are really nice. They're just sitting in my closet. Put them to use. Tommy chose the navy one. Dan took him to a tailor the next day, paid for the alterations without mentioning it, and coached him through interview prep. The kid landed the job. Jennifer was afraid of computers. The digital skills portion of their coursework gave her anxiety attacks. Dan stayed late at the library with her every Tuesday, patiently walking through basics. Click here. No, this icon. Okay, now save. See? You did it. I'm too old for this, Jennifer said, frustrated. Age has nothing to do with it. You're learning something new. That takes courage at any age. Slowly, her confidence grew. By midterm, she was helping other students with their spreadsheet assignments. The semester progressed. Dan's grades were excellent, but that wasn't the point. The point was showing up exhausted and doing the work anyway. The point was understanding that intelligence without application was useless. The point was recognizing that his previous success had been built on advantages he'd never acknowledged. These classmates had barriers Dan never faced. Childcare issues, transportation problems, financial stress, language barriers, past traumas. And yet they showed up, did the work, pushed forward. He'd spent years thinking he was exceptional. These people were actually exceptional, and they'd probably never receive recognition for it. Midway through the semester, Dan looked up during class and saw Rilea sitting in the back row. His heart nearly stopped. She was dressed like any other student, taking notes, completely unremarkable. But Dan would recognize her anywhere. She was watching him help Maria with a budget assignment, his voice patient and encouraging, no frustration when Maria needed concepts explained multiple times. After class, Dan caught up with her in the hallway. How long have you been auditing? 3 weeks, Riley admitted. Wanted to see how you approached this. And you're different. She said it matter-of-factly, not as praise or criticism, just observation. The Dan I knew would have been bored by basic concepts, would have made sure everyone knew he already understood the material, would have treated this like a waste of time. It's not a waste of time. I know, that's the difference. They walked toward the parking lot in silence. Dan wanted to say 1,000 things, but couldn't find words that felt adequate. Your classmates speak highly of you, Riley finally said. Maria told me you spent 4 hours helping her understand profit margins. Jennifer says you're the only reason she hasn't dropped out. Tommy credits you with his job interview success. They're good people. They deserve support. So you're not doing this for my approval. Dan stopped walking. Honestly, I started this for you, to prove I'd changed. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about you at all. These people, Maria, Jennifer, Tommy, they're real. They're fighting every day to build better lives. Helping them matters more than any deal I ever closed. Rilea studied him with those steady eyes. Good answer. Is it true? Because I'm not trying to impress you anymore. I'm trying to be someone I can respect when I look in the mirror. Something shifted in Rilea's expression. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but recognition, acknowledgement that change was happening, slowly and genuinely. Finish the semester, she said. Then we'll discuss the third condition. There's a third. There's always a third. A hint of a smile touched her lips. You didn't think 2 tests would be enough, did you? She walked to her car, a modest sedan, not the luxury vehicle she could easily afford, and drove away, leaving Dan standing in the parking lot under flickering streetlights. He pulled out his phone and saw a text from Maria. Thanks again for your help today. You're a good teacher and a better friend. Dan saved that message. It meant more than any professional accolade he'd ever received. The semester ended with straight A's across his transcript and a handwritten note from Professor Harrison. Your dedication to your classmates has been as impressive as your academic performance. Thank you for elevating the entire class. Graduation was a small ceremony in the college auditorium. Maria walked across the stage with her head high, her smile brilliant. Jennifer received her certificate with tears streaming down her face. Tommy's family showed up and cheered so loudly the dean had to ask for quiet. Dan clapped until his hands hurt, feeling genuine joy at their achievements. After the ceremony, an envelope was delivered to his seat. Inside, a single line in Riley's handwriting. Report to Klingel Industries next Monday, 9 in the morning. Executive floor. Time for the third condition. Chapter 7. The third condition. Dan arrived at Klingel Industries headquarters 15 minutes early, dressed in the one good suit he still owned. The building looked different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. He'd walked these halls before as a regional manager, invisible and diminished. Now he entered as someone who'd spent months doing work that actually mattered, and somehow that made the marble floors and soaring ceilings seem less intimidating. The receptionist directed him to the executive floor. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors opened, Riley's assistant was waiting. A professional woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Beth. Ms. Klingel is in conference room 3. She's asked you to wait inside. The conference room was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a massive table that could seat 20, artwork that probably cost more than Dan's annual salary. But what caught his attention were the 3 women already seated. One was older, wearing simple clothes and a weary expression that spoke of hard years and harder work. The resemblance to Riley was unmistakable, her mother's sister, Dan guessed. The second was younger, maybe late 20s, with Riley's eyes and a protective energy that radiated hostility the moment Dan entered. The third was Beth, who'd guided him here. Dan's stomach dropped. This wasn't a business meeting. This was something far more terrifying. Riley entered moments later, closing the door behind her with quiet finality. Dan, these are the people I trust most in the world. My aunt, Catherine, my sister Iris, and Beth, who's been with me since the beginning. Riley's voice was steady, controlled. You know me as the woman you dismissed. They know me as the person you hurt. Dan remained standing, unable to find words. Catherine spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd raised children through poverty and struggle. My sister, Riley's mother, worked herself to death so Riley could have opportunities. She never lived to see what her daughter built. But she saw you. Dan's chest tightened. She called me after meeting you, Catherine continued. Said Riley had found someone who made her smile. Said she seemed genuinely happy for the first time since losing her mother. We were relieved. We thought you'd be good for her. The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. Iris leaned forward, her expression fierce. Do you have any idea how rare it is for Riley to let someone in? She's the strongest person I know. She built an empire, runs companies, changes lives, and you made her feel small. Iris, Riley said quietly. No. Iris's voice shook with emotion. He needs to hear this. You came home crying after that restaurant, crying. You never cry. You've handled hostile takeovers and bankruptcy threats and industry attacks without flinching. But this man, this insignificant man, made you doubt yourself. Each word landed like a physical blow. Beth spoke next, her tone measured but firm. I've worked for Riley for 8 years. I've seen her handle impossible situations with grace. I've watched her build something extraordinary from nothing. And I've seen the way she tried to tell you about her work, about her life, about who she really was every time you interrupted. Every time you redirected the conversation to yourself. Dan found his voice finally. You're right. All of you, everything you're saying is completely right. We don't want your agreement, Catherine said. We want you to understand what you destroyed. My niece is brilliant, kind, generous, and lonely. She built all this. Catherine gestured at the room, the building, the empire beyond. But she wanted someone to share it with, not someone to impress, not someone to manage, a partner, an equal, someone who saw her. I didn't see her, Dan admitted, his voice breaking. I was so busy being seen that I never looked at her. Not really. Not the way she deserved. Riley had been silent through all of this, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. The third condition, she said finally, standing and moving to the windows, is the hardest one. You don't perform it for me. You face the people you hurt, not just me, but everyone your ego damaged, and then you help prevent others from making the same mistakes. She turned back to face him. I'm opening a leadership institute for women who've been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed, women who are brilliant, but have been made to feel inadequate by people like you used to be. You'll work there for 1 year. Dan waited, knowing there was more. You'll teach men how to listen, how to see competence instead of just compliance, how to value partnership over performance. And you'll share your story, every mistake, every assumption, every moment you chose your ego over someone else's humanity. You'll be publicly accountable. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on Dan's shoulders. If you agree, Riley continued, you'll work alongside these women. You'll help them rebuild confidence that men like your former self destroyed. You'll mentor young professionals on how to be better colleagues, better partners, better humans. I'll do it, Dan said without hesitation. You haven't heard the full condition yet, Riley warned. This isn't a job where you show up and collect a paycheck. You'll speak at events. You'll put your name and face on materials that detail your failures. Your professional reputation, what's left of it, will be tied forever to being the cautionary tale, the man who had everything and lost it because he couldn't see his own fiancé. I understand. Do you? Iris challenged. Because this means every future employer will know, every potential relationship will Google you and find this. You'll be defined by your worst moments. Good, Dan said quietly. Maybe I should be. Maybe that's exactly what I deserve. The room fell silent. Riley studied him for a long moment. This isn't about punishment, Dan. It's about transformation. The Institute's mission is healing, for the women we serve and for the men we teach. But I need to know you understand the gravity of what you're agreeing to. I do. I spent months working on a community center project that served the neighborhood where your mother raised you. I've spent a semester learning alongside people who've faced real struggles, real setbacks. I've had time to understand how much damage one person's ego can inflict on others. If sharing my failures can prevent even one person from making someone feel the way I made you feel, it's worth every bit of embarrassment. Catherine's expression softened slightly. What changed? Why should we believe this transformation is real? Dan met her eyes. Because for the first time in my adult life, I'm more ashamed of who I was than proud of who I'm becoming, because I helped a woman named Maria rebuild her confidence after an abusive marriage, and I watched her succeed in ways her ex-husband said were impossible. Because I saw Jennifer, a woman your age, conquer her fear of technology with nothing but determination. Because I spent 6 months doing work where nobody knew my name, and it mattered more than anything I did when everyone knew it. He turned to Riley. I can't undo what I did to you. I can't give you back the time you wasted on someone who didn't appreciate you. But I can spend every day trying to make sure other women don't experience what you went through. Not because it'll earn your forgiveness, I don't deserve that, but because it's the right thing to do. Iris looked at Riley. Some silent communication passed between the sisters. 1 year, Riley said. Full commitment. If you miss sessions, if you half-effort this, if you make it about your redemption instead of their healing, you're done. Not just with the Institute, with any possibility of us ever speaking again. Understood. Beth handed him a folder. Start date, orientation schedule, first speaking engagement. You have 2 weeks to prepare. Dan opened the folder. The speaking engagement was at a women's business conference. The title, What I Lost When I Couldn't See Her, a cautionary tale about ego and partnership. His stomach churned at the thought of standing on a stage, detailing his failures in front of hundreds of people. But he'd agreed, and he'd meant it. Thank you, he said to the room, all of you, for caring enough about Riley to protect her, for holding me accountable, for believing change is possible even when I didn't deserve that benefit of the doubt. Catherine stood, approaching him slowly. She was a small woman, but her presence felt enormous. I'm not doing this for you, she said firmly. I'm doing this for every woman who's been dismissed by a man too proud to see her value. You hurt my niece. That doesn't wash away with pretty words or good intentions. But if you can prevent other women from being hurt the same way, then maybe something good can come from the pain you caused. She extended her hand. Dan shook it, feeling the calluses from years of hard work. Don't make me regret giving you this chance, Catherine warned. I won't. Iris remained seated, her arms crossed. I'm not shaking your hand. You haven't earned that yet. But I'll be watching. Every speech, every session, every interaction with the women at this institute, one slip, one hint that you're using this to rebuild your reputation instead of helping them, and I'll make sure everyone knows. Fair enough. Riley walked Dan to the door. For the first time since that night at the Sterling house, they were alone together. One question, she said quietly. Dan waited. What did you learn? Really learn? Not what you think I want to hear. What fundamentally changed in you? Dan considered carefully. I learned that being important is worthless compared to being useful. I learned that listening is harder than talking, but infinitely more valuable. I learned that strength looks nothing like I thought it did. It's not about dominating or impressing. It's about showing up consistently for people who need you. And I learned that I spent my whole life collecting achievements to prove my worth, when my worth wasn't dependent on achievements at all. Riley's expression remained neutral. And I learned that I loved you, but I never knew you. Because knowing someone requires caring about their inner world more than your own, I loved the idea of you, someone pretty and pleasant who made me feel successful. I never loved the real you, because I never bothered to discover who that was. A flicker of emotion crossed Riley's face, gone so quickly Dan almost missed it. The real me is standing right here, she said softly. Same person I was then. You just couldn't see me past your own reflection. I see you now, Dan said. Brilliant, fierce, compassionate, stronger than anyone I've ever met. Building things that matter, changing lives without needing applause. Everything I pretended to be, you actually are. And I'm sorrier than I have words for that I wasted your time. Riley opened the conference room door. 2 weeks. Don't be late for orientation. As Dan stepped into the elevator, he looked back. Riley stood in the doorway, surrounded by the women who loved and protected her, and for the first time, he saw her completely clearly. Not as his girlfriend or his loss, but as a whole person with a history, a family, a purpose that had nothing to do with him. She'd built something extraordinary from grief and determination. She'd honored her mother's memory by giving others opportunities her mother never had. She'd wielded enormous power with grace and humility, and he'd told her to go home because she wasn't at his level. The elevator doors closed, and Dan finally understood the full magnitude of what he'd lost, not because of what Riley could do for him, but because of who she was when nobody was watching. A year at the Institute wouldn't fix that. A lifetime probably wouldn't. But it was a start. Chapter 8. Rebuilding More Than Buildings. The first speaking engagement nearly destroyed Dan before he even reached the podium. 500 women filled the conference hall, professionals, entrepreneurs, executives. They'd paid good money to attend this leadership summit, expecting valuable insights. Instead, they were getting Dan's confession. He stood backstage, hands shaking, stomach threatening rebellion. The host was introducing him, reading from the bio he'd submitted that detailed every mistake, every dismissal, every moment of ego over empathy. Please welcome Dan Simmons, who will share his journey from being the problem to trying to become part of the solution. Applause was polite but cautious. These women didn't know him, didn't owe him kindness. Dan walked on stage and immediately wanted to run. "I'm going to tell you about the worst version of myself," he began, his voice unsteady. "Not because I want sympathy, but because maybe, if you recognize this behavior in colleagues or partners, or even yourselves, something can change before someone gets hurt." He told them everything. The restaurant, dismissing Riley, his obliviousness to her accomplishments, the way he'd centered himself in every conversation, made himself the sun around which she was expected to orbit. "I told a woman worth billions to go home because she wasn't at my level," Dan said, the words tasting like ash. "I interrupted her constantly. I never asked about her work. I treated her intelligence like a cute quirk instead of recognizing it for what it was, vastly superior to my own." The room was silent. No sympathetic murmurs, just watchful attention. "The thing is, I didn't wake up one day and decide to be dismissive. It happened gradually. Little moments where I talked over her. Conversations where I assumed I knew better. Decisions I made without consulting her. Each small moment felt insignificant. Together, they told her she didn't matter." A woman in the third row raised her hand. Dan nodded. "What made you realize you were wrong?" "Losing her," Dan admitted. "Watching 20 of the most powerful people in the country treat her with respect I never showed her. Reading articles about her accomplishments and realizing I'd shared a bed with someone for months without knowing basic facts about her life. The realization came too late to save the relationship, but not too late to change myself." Another hand. Older woman, sharp eyes. "Why should we trust this transformation? How do we know this isn't just another performance?" Fair question. Brutal, but fair. "You shouldn't trust it based on my words," Dan said. "Judge it by my actions moving forward. I'm not here asking for forgiveness or applause. I'm here offering myself as a warning. If even one person in this room recognizes themselves or their partner in my story and makes different choices, that's worth every moment of discomfort this causes me." The questions continued for an hour, some hostile, some curious, all challenging. Dan answered each honestly, refusing to soften his failures or excuse his behavior. When it ended, the applause was warmer but still measured. He'd earned nothing except the opportunity to keep trying. Backstage, Iris was waiting. She'd watched from the wings, her expression unreadable. "That was hard to watch," she said bluntly. "It was hard to deliver." "Good. It should be." Iris handed him a water bottle. "You didn't try to make yourself the victim, didn't ask for pity. That's something, I guess." "Is Riley here?" "No. She's in meetings all day, but she'll watch the recording." Iris studied him carefully. "Why do you care if she sees it?" Dan considered the question. "Because I want her to know I'm taking this seriously. Not for her approval. I've learned that lesson. But because she trusted me with this opportunity, despite having every reason not to. She didn't do this for you, you know. The institute, the speaking engagements, none of it. She did it for the women who need to hear that they're not crazy for feeling dismissed, that their experiences are valid." "I know." Iris's expression softened fractionally. "Keep showing up. Keep being honest. Maybe eventually it'll mean something." The work at the institute was harder than any job Dan had held. He ran workshops for women rebuilding confidence after professional setbacks, led discussions on navigating workplace dynamics, coached individuals on negotiation tactics and self-advocacy. Every session reminded him of what he'd done to Riley. One participant, a woman named Hannah, described her former boss. He'd ask my opinion in meetings, then repeat my exact idea 5 minutes later like it was his own. When I called him on it, he acted confused, like I was being oversensitive. Dan recognized that behavior. He'd done it to Riley, taken her insights, packaged them as his own brilliance, never acknowledging the source. "That's not oversensitivity," Dan told Hannah. "That's theft. He stole your intellectual labor and your credit. You have every right to be angry. But how do I handle it without seeming difficult?" And there it was, the impossible position women were forced into. Assert yourself. Be labeled difficult. Stay silent. Be erased. "You shouldn't have to handle it carefully," Dan said. "He should handle himself professionally. But since we don't live in that world yet, here are some strategies." They practiced responses, ways to reclaim credit without seeming aggressive, documentation methods, building ally networks, all the exhausting labor women had to perform because men like his former self couldn't be trusted to act decently. Another participant, Simone, shared her experience. "My partner constantly explains my own field to me. I have advanced degrees, published research, and he still feels the need to clarify concepts I literally teach." The group laughed in recognition. Every woman had a story like that. Dan didn't laugh. "I did that to my fiancée. She ran companies, employed thousands, changed entire industries. I explained basic business concepts to her like she was a child. I'm ashamed to admit how long it took me to realize how insulting that was." "What would you say to him?" Simone asked. "To your former self?" "That your ego is not worth her diminishment, that her patience with your condescension was not proof of its acceptability, it was evidence of her grace, and that you're destroying something precious because you need to feel superior more than you need genuine connection." The room went quiet. "Would it have worked?" Simone pressed. "If someone had told you that then?" Dan thought about it honestly. "Probably not. I wasn't ready to hear it. I had to lose everything before I could see clearly, which is tragic and stupid, but it's the truth." Months passed. Dan spoke at dozens of events, ran countless workshops, mentored individuals rebuilding from various forms of professional dismissal. Each story reinforced how widespread the problem was. Men talking over women, claiming their ideas, dismissing their competence, treating them as decorative rather than capable. He'd been part of the problem. Now, he was trying to be part of the solution. But the work took its toll. Every session meant confronting his failures repeatedly. Every participant's story reminded him of Riley's quiet pain. Every success they achieved made him think about the success he'd denied her. Not professional success, she'd achieved that without him, but the simple success of being heard and valued by the person who claimed to love her one evening. After a particularly difficult workshop, where a participant had broken down describing years of being undermined by her husband, Dan sat alone in the Institute's office and cried, not for himself. For all the Rileys in the world, for every brilliant woman made to feel small, for every moment of quiet suffering that men like him had caused through obliviousness or malice, Beth found him there, his face in his hands. "Rough session?" Dan nodded, unable to speak. She sat across from him, her expression kind but firm. "This is the work, Dan. Seeing the damage clearly, feeling its weight, knowing you contributed to it and can't undo that harm." "How do you bear it?" Dan asked, watching Riley navigate a world designed to dismiss her. "By being there when she needs support and celebrating when she succeeds despite the obstacles, and by fighting to change the systems that create those obstacles in the first place." "I should have been that person for her," Dan said quietly. "I should have been her champion, her supporter, her safe space. Instead, I was another obstacle she had to navigate around." "Yes," Beth agreed simply, "you were. But you're not anymore. That's not redemption. Redemption isn't possible for some harms, but it's growth. It matters, even if it doesn't fix what's broken. That night, Dan wrote in the journal his therapist had recommended. He'd filled 3 notebooks now, tracking his transformation, his setbacks, his painful realizations. Today I understood why Relia set these conditions, he wrote, not to punish me, but to force me to see, really see. The community center showed me what meaningful work looks like. The college classes showed me what struggle feels like. The institute is showing me the full scope of damage that people like my former self inflict daily. Each condition built on the last. Each one stripped away another layer of the ego that blinded me. I'm not grateful for the pain I caused her, that would be obscene. But I'm grateful she cared enough to offer me a path toward becoming better. Most people, she could have simply erased me and moved on. Instead, she's giving me the chance to help others. That's grace I don't deserve, but will spend my life trying to honor. His phone buzzed. A message from Beth. Rylia watched your talk from the conference. She asked me to tell you to keep going. That's all. Just keep going. Dan stared at those words for a long time. Not approval, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement that she was paying attention. It was enough. The year at the Institute stretched ahead of him. More workshops, more speaking engagements, more confrontations with uncomfortable truths. But for the first time since losing Rylia, Dan felt like he was building towards something rather than running from something. He didn't know if she'd ever speak to him again beyond professional necessity, didn't know if forgiveness was even a possibility, didn't know what came after his year at the Institute ended. But he knew he was becoming someone different, someone who listened more than he spoke, someone who valued others' contributions above his own comfort, someone who could sit with his own failures without deflecting or excusing someone who, maybe eventually, might deserve a second chance, not with Rylia necessarily, but with life itself. The work continued. One difficult conversation at a time, one challenging workshop at a time, one honest speech at a time. Dan showed up, did the work, kept going. Because Rylia had asked him to, and because she deserved to have that request honored, even if nothing else between them could ever be repaired. Chapter 9. The reunion she deserved. 15 months after that night at the Sterling House, Dan stood in the back of a hotel ballroom, adjusting his microphone for the Institute's first annual gala. He wasn't attending as a guest. He'd volunteered for sound equipment duty, making sure every speaker could be heard clearly. The role suited him. Essential, but invisible. Supporting rather than performing. The event was celebrating women who'd graduated from the Institute's programs. Success stories who'd rebuilt careers, launched businesses, found their voices after years of being silenced. Dan had worked with many of them, watched them transform from uncertain to unstoppable. His own transformation felt less dramatic, but equally profound. He dressed differently now, simply, practically. His apartment remained modest by choice rather than necessity. He'd saved money from his institute salary, but spent it on donations rather than status symbols. The Rolex collection was a distant memory. He wore a simple watch that told time without making announcements. The ballroom filled with people Dan recognized from various workshops and sessions, women who'd trusted him with their stories, who'd challenged him when he slipped into old patterns, who'd taught him more than he'd ever taught them, and then Rylia arrived. She wore midnight blue, elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of dress that whispered confidence instead of shouting it. Her hair was different, shorter now, framing her face in a way that made her eyes even more striking. She moved through the crowd with the same quiet authority he'd witnessed at the Sterling House, greeting people warmly, remembering details about their lives. Dan's chest ached watching her. Not with the desperate yearning of early loss, but with deep respect for who she was and acceptance that he'd forfeited his place beside her. She was here as the keynote speaker, the Institute's founder, the woman who'd turned her own painful experience into something that helped hundreds of others. Dan finished checking the sound system and moved to slip out a side exit. His work was done. This celebration belonged to the graduates, to Ryla, to everyone who'd done the real heavy lifting of change. Dan. Her voice stopped him mid-step. He turned. Riley stood a few feet away, holding something, papers, he realized as she approached. "I've been reading your speech transcripts," she said without preamble. "Every talk you've given this year, Beth sends them to me." Dan waited, uncertain how to respond. "The one in Chicago was particularly powerful. You talked about the difference between apologizing and changing, about how sorry means nothing without sustained action." "I meant every word." "I know." Rilea's expression remained unreadable. "That's what surprised me. You've been consistent for over a year. No backsliding, no performance, just steady, unglamorous work." "It's the least I could do." "It's more than most people would do." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "The Institute has been more successful than I projected. We've had to expand twice. We're planning international chapters. The demand is overwhelming." "That's incredible." "It is, and it exists partly because you were willing to stand up and be the cautionary tale, to let your failures educate others. That took courage I didn't think you had." The compliment felt uncomfortable. "I don't deserve credit for cleaning up my own mess." "True. But you deserve acknowledgement for actually cleaning it up instead of just apologizing and moving on." Riley gestured toward the ballroom. "These women, you've helped them, really helped them. They speak highly of you. Not as a savior, but as someone who's done the work to understand his own damage and is trying to prevent others from causing similar harm." Dan felt his throat tighten. "They helped me more than I helped them." "That's how growth works. It's collaborative, not hierarchical." Riley handed him the papers. "I'm offering you a permanent position, Director of Men's Engagement Programs, developing curriculum to help men become better colleagues, partners, allies. It's not glamorous, the pay is moderate. You'll face constant resistance from men who don't think they need changing, but the work matters." Dan looked at the job description. Everything she'd said was accurate. Hard work, modest compensation, endless challenges. "I'll take it," he said immediately. "You didn't even ask about specifics." "I don't need to. If it helps even one person avoid making the mistakes I made, it's worth whatever difficulty comes with it." Riley studied him with those steady eyes. "You're different, genuinely different. Your aunt was right. People can change if they're willing to do the work." "I had excellent motivation and excellent teachers." Dan met her gaze. "Thank you for not just writing me off, for believing change was possible even when I didn't deserve that benefit of the doubt." "I didn't do it for you," Riley said firmly. "I did it for every woman who needs to see that calling out bad behavior can lead to actual accountability, that we don't have to accept dismissal as inevitable." "I know, that's what makes it meaningful." The ballroom was filling up. Soon Riley would need to prepare for her speech. "One question," Dan said before she could leave. "You asked me once what I learned. What I really learned. Can I tell you what I learned today?" Riley nodded. "I learned that you were never waiting for me to notice your accomplishments. You didn't need my validation. What you wanted was simple presence, someone who asked about your day and actually listened, someone who valued your thoughts because they came from you, not because they were impressive, someone who saw you as a whole person rather than a supporting character in their own story." "And?" Riley prompted softly. "And I learned that love without respect is worthless. I thought I loved you, but I didn't respect you enough to truly see you. Real love requires paying attention to someone else's inner world, not just enjoying their presence in yours." Something shifted in Riley's expression. The professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something more vulnerable. "That's the first time you've articulated what you actually took from me," she said quietly. "Not my time or my patience or my potential. My right to be fully seen by someone who claimed to love me." "I'm sorry," Dan said, the words inadequate but sincere, "for all of it. For every interruption, every dismissal, Every moment I made you feel less than you are. You deserved a partner. I gave you an audience member who was too busy watching his own performance to notice the real show was happening right beside him. Tears threatened at the corners of Rylea's eyes. She blinked them back firmly. "Don't apologize now," she said. "Not here, not tonight. This event is about celebrating the women who rebuilt themselves, about honoring their strength, not revisiting pain." "You're right. I'm sorry." Dan caught himself. "I mean, you're right. This is their night." Rylea almost smiled at his self-correction. "See? You're learning." She started to walk away, then paused, turning back. "Dan?" "Yes?" "After the gala, after the graduates have celebrated and everyone's gone home, meet me in the lobby midnight. We need to talk, really talk. Not about work or programs or the institute, about us, whether there's any possibility of us." Dan's heart stuttered. "Are you sure?" "No," Rylea admitted. "I'm not sure at all. But you've done everything I asked. You've changed in ways I didn't think possible, and I need to know if the man you've become is someone I could trust. Not trust to be perfect, trust to be honest, to be present, to see me." "I'll be there," Dan promised. "Don't make promises yet. You don't know what I'm going to say." She walked away then, disappearing into the crowd of graduates and supporters, leaving Dan standing alone with hope and terror warring in his chest. The gala began. Dan worked backstage, managing equipment, solving small crises, ensuring everything ran smoothly. He watched Rylea give her keynote speech, powerful, vulnerable, inspiring. She spoke about her mother, about growing up with nothing, about building something meaningful from loss and determination. "This institute exists because someone made me feel small," Rylea said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "and I decided that feeling should be the last thing any woman experiences. We deserve to be seen fully, valued completely, heard genuinely, not as exceptions, not as special cases, as the rule, as the standard, as exactly who we are." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Dan clapped until his hands hurt, watching this extraordinary woman he'd been too blind to appreciate, wondering if she could ever trust him enough to try again. Midnight approached like both salvation and judgment. When the last guest departed and the ballroom crew began cleanup, Dan made his way to the lobby. His mouth was dry. His hands trembled slightly. Everything he'd worked toward for the past 15 months came down to whatever Riley was about to say. She was already there, sitting on a bench near the windows, still in her midnight blue dress, but with her heels off, bare feet tucked beneath her. She looked up when he approached, and for the first time in over a year, she smiled at him. Not the professional smile she gave colleagues, the real smile he remembered from Montana. "Sit," she said, patting the bench beside her. Dan sat, careful to leave space between them. "I have 3 questions," Riley began. "Answer them honestly, not what you think I want to hear, the truth." "Okay. First, what do you actually want from me? Not what you think you should want, what you genuinely want." Dan took a breath. "I want to know you, really know you. I want to hear about your day and understand what it meant to you. I want to know what makes you laugh, what keeps you up at night, what dreams you have beyond the ones you've already accomplished. I want to be someone you trust enough to share your thoughts with, knowing I'll actually listen. And I want, if it's even possible, the chance to build something together where we're both fully present. Both fully seen." Rylea nodded slowly. "Second question. What scares you most about trying again?" "That I'll slip back into old patterns without realizing it. That I'll hurt you again despite my best intentions. That I've changed enough to know what partnership should look like, but not enough to actually be a good partner. That you'll give me a second chance and I'll prove your sister right. That I haven't actually transformed, just gotten better at performing transformation." "Good answer. Honest." Rylea turned to face him fully. "Third question. If I said no tonight, if I said the damage was too deep and too much time had passed, could you accept that and keep doing this work? Or would you burn out and disappear? I'd keep doing the work, Dan said without hesitation. Not because it would win you back, but because it's who I want to be now. The Institute matters. The men I teach matter. The women whose lives improve when the men around them change. They matter. This isn't a performance to earn forgiveness anymore. This is who I'm choosing to become. Rilea was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. I loved you, she said finally. The man I thought you were, the man I glimpsed in Montana. I loved him. But he didn't really exist. You were performing him, and I was falling for a performance. I know. But the man you've become over this past year, him I don't know yet. Not really. I've seen his work, read his speeches, heard reports from people he's helped, but I don't know his heart, his hopes, his fears beyond the obvious ones. What are you saying? Dan asked carefully. I'm saying we start over, completely over. No history, no assumptions. You take me on a first date like we've never met. I ask you questions like I'm trying to decide if you're worth my time. We build something new instead of trying to resurrect something that died. Hope bloomed in Dan's chest, terrifying and brilliant. And if we discover we're not compatible, if starting fresh means discovering we don't actually work together, then we stay colleagues and friends and respect what we built through this process, even if it doesn't become romance. But Dan, her voice turned serious. If you ever, even once, make me feel less than I am, if you dismiss me or talk over me or treat my intelligence like a quirk instead of recognizing it as superior to your own, I walk away permanently. No third chances, no more growth opportunities, just done. Fair, Dan agreed. More than fair. Rilea stood, slipping her heels back on. Coffee, Thursday evening. That small place in Brooklyn where we had our first date. Except this time, you ask me questions, you listen to my answers, you tell me about your life honestly instead of trying to impress me. We see if there's actually anything real between who we both are now. I'll be there, Dan said. Don't make me regret this, Riley warned. I'll spend every day trying not to. She walked toward the exit, then looked back over her shoulder. Dan? Yes? The man you've become, he's someone worth knowing. I don't know yet if he's someone I could love again, but he's someone I can respect. That's more than I expected. It's a start. And then she was gone, leaving Dan alone in an empty hotel lobby at midnight, holding the fragile possibility of a second chance in hands that finally understood how precious it was. Chapter 10. The reunion she deserved. 6 months of slow rebuilding. That's what it took before Riley stopped looking at Dan like he might disappear back into his old patterns. Their first coffee date in Brooklyn had been awkward and careful. Dan asked questions and actually waited for answers. What was her typical day like? What projects excited her? What frustrated her about running such a large company? Rilea had answered cautiously at first, testing whether he'd interrupt or redirect the conversation. When he didn't, when he followed up with genuine curiosity, something in her posture relaxed. Tell me about your mother, Dan had said during that first date. Not the accomplishments or the sacrifices. What was she like as a person? Riley's eyes had filled with tears. No one ever asks that. They want to know what she did for me, not who she was. She'd talked for an hour about her mother's humor, her strength, her quiet wisdom. Dan listened to every word, asked follow-up questions that showed he was paying attention, never once made it about himself. When they'd parted that evening, Riley had said simply, "Same time next week?" The dates that followed were nothing like their previous relationship, no expensive restaurants meant to impress, no performance of success, just conversations, long walks through Central Park, museums where they discussed art for hours, a terrible action movie they both laughed through. Dan learned things he'd never known. Riley loved terrible puns, but pretended not to. She was terrified of birds, but wouldn't admit it. She played piano beautifully, a skill her mother had insisted she learn. She cried at documentaries about ocean conservation. She learned about him too, his insecurities that had fueled all that posturing, his fear of being ordinary, the way he'd confused importance with worth, performance with substance. "Who are you now?" Rylea asked one evening as they sat by the river, watching boats drift past. "I'm still figuring that out," Dan admitted, "but I know who I'm not. I'm not the guy who needs to be the smartest person in the room. I'm not the guy who measures worth by accomplishments. I'm not the guy who treats relationships like audience participation. Who do you want to be? Someone useful, someone kind, someone who shows up consistently for people who need me, someone who listens more than he speaks." He paused. "Someone worthy of being your partner, if you'll have me." Rylea didn't answer immediately. They sat in silence, comfortable now instead of tense. "I'm still scared," she finally said. "Of me? Of trusting you? Of letting my guard down and discovering this is temporary, that the real you is still the man from the Sterling house, just hidden better." Dan's heart ached. "I understand that fear. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, but I can promise I'll never intentionally make you feel small again. And if I slip without realizing it, I'll listen when you call me on it." "That's all I need," Rylea said softly. "Not perfection, just honesty and willingness to keep growing." They'd been dating, if that's what it was, for 4 months when Rylea invited Dan to dinner at her apartment, a real apartment, not the penthouse he'd imagined, a modest space in the neighborhood where she'd grown up, deliberately chosen to stay connected to her roots. The walls held photos of her mother, her Aunt Catherine, her sister Iris. Awards and accolades were nowhere to be seen. This was a home, not a showpiece. Dan cooked, simple pasta, nothing fancy, while Rylea told him about her day. A challenging negotiation, a problem employee she had to address, the new hospital wing opening next month. "How would you handle it?" she asked about the employee situation. "The performance issues, I mean. Are you asking for advice or thinking through it out loud?" "Thinking through it out loud. You're good at listening without jumping to solutions." "Then I'm listening," Dan said, stirring the sauce. She worked through her thoughts while he cooked, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just providing space for her to process. When she reached her conclusion, she smiled. "That helped. Thank you. I didn't do anything. You were present. That's everything." Over dinner, Riley asked the question Dan had been dreading and hoping for. "Where do you see this going? Us, I mean." Dan set down his fork, met her eyes. "Honestly, I see building something real. No performance, no pretense. I see supporting each other's work without competing. I see conversations where we're both fully present. I see partnership where we're equals in every way that matters." "That's what you see. What do you want?" "I want you," Dan said simply. "Not because you're successful or wealthy or impressive, though you're all those things. I want you because you're kind in ways that cost you nothing but mean everything to others, because you remember people, because you turned your pain into something that helps hundreds, because when you laugh at terrible puns, it's the best sound I've ever heard." Rylea's eyes glistened. "I want you too, the real you, the one who volunteers for sound equipment duty instead of seeking applause, the one who helps women rebuild their confidence without needing credit, the one who actually listens when I talk about my day." "So what now?" Dan asked. "Now we try. Really try. No holding back, no waiting for the other shoe to drop. We build something together where we're both fully seen." Dan reached across the table, took her hand. "I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of that trust. Don't promise perfection, promise presence, promise honesty, promise you'll keep doing the work to be better." "I promise," Dan said, and meant it with everything he had. The months that followed weren't a fairy tale. They fought sometimes, usually when Dan slipped into old patterns without realizing it. The first time he interrupted her, Rylea called him on it immediately. "You just talked over me." Dan froze, horror washing over him. "You're right. I'm sorry." "What were you saying?" She'd looked at him carefully, searching for defensiveness. When she found only genuine remorse, she continued her thought. He listened without interrupting again. They learned each other's rhythms. Riley worked intense hours but made time for what mattered. Dan supported her without needing to be involved in every decision. They celebrated her successes together. A major contract won, a new program launched, recognition she'd actually accepted for once. One evening, almost a year after that midnight conversation in the hotel lobby, they returned to Montana. The same roadside motel with the buzzing neon sign. Rain started falling just as they arrived, exactly like before. But this time, everything was different. They stood outside, letting the rain soak through their clothes, and Dan saw Riley fully, not as a prize he'd won or lost, not as proof of his worth or failure, just as Riley. Brilliant, beautiful, complex, funny, fierce Riley. "I love you," he said, the words meaning something entirely different than they had before. "Not the idea of you, you." The woman standing in front of me, soaking wet and laughing at the absurdity of deliberately standing in the rain. "I love you too," Riley said, and Dan heard the truth in it. The real you, the one who finally learned to see. They kissed in the rain, and it felt like a beginning instead of a second chance. Something new and honest and built on actual foundation. Inside the motel room, as thunder rattled the windows like it had before, Dan asked, "What are you thinking about?" Riley smiled. "That took you long enough to ask." "Better late than never?" "Much better." She curled against him. "I'm thinking about how far we've both come, how much work it took, how it almost didn't happen." "Are you glad it did?" "Ask me in 20 years, Riley said, but her smile was warm. "For now, I'm glad we're trying, really trying, building something together instead of you building a performance and me being the audience." "Equal partners," Dan confirmed. "Equal partners," Riley agreed, "in everything that matters." Outside, the storm continued, but inside the room, two people who'd found each other, lost each other, and slowly built something new from honest foundation, finally rested in the quiet certainty that this time they were both fully present. This time, they both saw clearly. And that, Riley thought as she drifted towards sleep, made all the difference.